Jack Reed, a man whose life revolved around the meticulous examination of maritime insurance claims, stared out at the churning gray expanse of the Atlantic. The salty air whipped at his face, a stark contrast to the sterile confines of his office. He pulled his trench coat tighter, the damp chill seeping into his bones. He was on the New England coast, a place he usually associated with clam chowder and quaint seaside towns, not burning cargo ships. The Albatross, a mid-sized freighter registered in Panama, had been reduced to a charred skeleton, now resting on the seabed. Its demise, a fiery spectacle witnessed by a lone fishing vessel, was the subject of Jack's current investigation. The official report cited an unexplained explosion followed by a rapidly spreading fire. One survivor, a woman named Clara, had been plucked from the inferno by the fishing vessel's captain, Samuel Wallace. Jack's first interview was with Clara at the local hospital. She was wrapped in a hospital blanket, her face pale and drawn, her eyes haunted by the ordeal. Her responses were fragmented, punctuated by trembling breaths and long silences. She spoke of a sudden blast, the acrid smell of smoke, the frantic scramble for lifeboats. But the details were hazy, obscured by trauma and shock. She couldn't recall the specific location of the explosion or what might have caused it. Her fragmented memories offered little to quell the unease that had begun to knot in Jack's stomach. This was supposed to be a routine investigation, a straightforward case of accidental fire. Yet, the scant information he had gathered thus far whispered of something more. His next meeting was with Samuel Wallace down at the docks. Wallace, a weathered man with eyes that held the deep blue of the ocean, cut a striking figure against the backdrop of fishing nets and lobster traps. He recounted the rescue with a quiet dignity, describing how he'd seen the flames against the night sky, the desperate cries echoing across the water. He'd navigated his small boat through treacherous currents, getting as close as he dared to the burning Albatross. He'd found Clara clinging to a piece of debris, pulled her aboard, and watched as the freighter slipped beneath the waves. Wallace's narrative was detailed and consistent, yet Jack couldn't shake a nagging sense of discrepancy. Something in the captain's demeanor, a subtle hesitation in his voice, pricked at Jack's instincts. It was a feeling he'd learned to trust over years of investigating maritime incidents. He pressed Wallace for more details about the Albatross, the location of the fire, the type of cargo it carried. Wallace's answers were evasive, claiming he hadn't seen much in the chaos of the rescue. He insisted he was simply a good Samaritan, a sailor who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Back in his rented room overlooking the harbor, Jack spread out the ship's manifest and crew records on the small table. The Albatross had been carrying a mixed cargo of textiles, machinery, and canned goods, nothing particularly flammable or valuable. The crew list was equally unremarkable, a mix of nationalities with unremarkable backgrounds. Yet, as he meticulously cross-referenced the documents with Clara's testimony and Wallace's account, small inconsistencies began to surface. The cargo manifest listed the weight of the ship as significantly heavier than what would be expected for the declared goods. Clara had mentioned hearing a series of smaller explosions before the main blast, something Wallace hadn't mentioned in his report. The discrepancies, while small, were enough to fan the embers of Jack's suspicion into a flickering flame. He reviewed the photographs of the sunken Albatross taken by the Coast Guard. The damage seemed more extensive than what one might expect from a simple fire. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, a crucial piece of the puzzle hidden beneath the waves and the conflicting narratives. His gaze drifted towards the window, where the lights of fishing boats bobbed gently in the harbor. One of those lights belonged to Samuel Wallace. Jack found himself fixating on it, the unease in his gut solidifying into a cold, hard suspicion. He decided to pay Captain Wallace another visit in the morning. The following morning, a thick fog clung to the harbor, shrouding the fishing boats in a ghostly veil. Jack found Wallace mending nets on the deck of his vessel, the Seafarer. He explained his concerns about the discrepancies he'd found, the inconsistencies between the manifest, Clara's testimony, and Wallace's own account. Wallace listened patiently, his weathered face inscrutable. He attributed the differences to the chaos of the situation, the trauma experienced by Clara, the difficulty of accurately assessing details in the midst of a raging inferno. "Mr. Reed," Wallace said, his voice calm and steady, "I understand you have a job to do. But I assure you I've told you everything I know. I was simply a passing ship that rendered aid. I've no reason to lie." Jack pressed further, questioning the heavier-than-expected weight listed on the Albatross's manifest. Wallace shrugged. Cargo manifests aren't always accurate. Maybe they took on extra supplies at the last minute. It's not uncommon. Jack mentioned Clara's recollection of multiple explosions. Wallace frowned, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. I only heard one, he said, a big one. But in that kind of situation it's easy to misinterpret things. The fire, the noise, the fear, it can play tricks on your mind. Jack wasn't convinced. Wallace's explanations, while plausible, felt carefully crafted, designed to deflect suspicion. He decided to change tack, asking about Wallace's own background, his experience at sea. Wallace's easy demeanor shifted slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his features. He spoke vaguely of years spent fishing these waters, of various cargo runs up and down the coast. He avoided specifics, offering only generalizations. Jack's instinct screamed foul play. He returned to his rented room and delved deeper into the ship's records. He discovered that the Albatross's registered owner was a shell corporation based in the Cayman Islands, notorious for its opaque financial dealings. He traced the ship's recent voyages, finding a pattern of irregular routes and unscheduled stops at isolated ports. The more he dug, the more convinced he became that the Albatross wasn't just a simple cargo ship. It was involved in something illicit, something dangerous. And he suspected Samuel Wallace was at the center of it. He spent the next few days poring over shipping records, insurance documents, and customs reports. He cross-referenced crew manifests with immigration databases, looking for any anomalies, any connections that might shed light on the Albatross's true purpose. He discovered that several of the crew members listed on the manifest had criminal records, ranging from smuggling to drug trafficking. The pieces were starting to fit together, painting a picture of a clandestine operation gone wrong. The fire, Jack now believed, was no accident. It was a deliberate act, a desperate attempt to destroy evidence. He focused his attention back on Samuel Wallace. He investigated Wallace's financial records, finding unexplained deposits and transfers to offshore accounts. He learned that Wallace owned a small fleet of fishing boats, one of which had recently been seized by the Coast Guard for carrying undeclared cargo. The evidence, circumstantial yet compelling, pointed squarely at Wallace. He was the prime suspect. Jack decided to visit the port town where the Albatross was registered. He hoped to glean some information from the local dockworkers and fishermen, hoping someone would break the wall of silence that seemed to surround the incident. The town was a small, tightly knit community, where everyone knew everyone else's business. He spent hours talking to people in the local bars and cafes, casually asking about the Albatross, about Samuel Wallace. He encountered a mixture of evasiveness and outright hostility. People were reluctant to talk, their eyes darting nervously around before offering vague responses. Some claimed to know nothing, others warned him to mind his own business. He sensed a palpable air of fear, as if an unspoken threat hung over the town. He finally found an old fisherman who, after several beers, agreed to speak, though his words were cryptic and laced with warnings. He spoke of Wallace's other activities, of his connections to powerful people who operated outside the law. He hinted at a smuggling operation involving rare artifacts and illicit substances. Wallace is a dangerous man, the old fisherman whispered, his voice raspy with years of sea air and cheap whiskey. You'd be wise to leave him alone. Jack left the town with more questions than answers, but his suspicions were now hardened into certainty. He was convinced that Wallace was involved in something illegal, something that had led to the burning of the Albatross. He returned to his rented room, a sense of foreboding settling over him. He felt as if he was walking a tightrope, balancing precariously between uncovering the truth and stepping into a dangerous game. That night, his room was ransacked. Drawers were pulled open, files scattered across the floor, the contents of his suitcase emptied onto the bed. Nothing was taken, but the message was clear: back off. The next day he noticed he was being followed. Shadowy figures lingered at the edges of his vision, disappearing into the crowds whenever he turned to confront them. He received anonymous phone calls, the voice on the other and a menacing whisper warning him to drop the investigation. The intimidation tactics only solidified his resolve. He knew he was close to the truth and he wouldn't be deterred. He was playing a dangerous game and the stakes were getting higher. The port town where the Albatross was registered clung to the rocky coastline like a barnacle. Salt-laced air hung heavy, carrying the mingled scents of fish, diesel, and decay. Jack stepped off the bus onto the cracked pavement, the rumble of the engine fading into the rhythmic slap of waves against the pier. This was his last hope, a place where loose lips and hushed whispers might reveal the secrets the official reports concealed. He started his inquiries at the waterfront taverns, places where seasoned fishermen and grizzled dockworkers gathered to swap stories and drown their sorrows. He nursed a lukewarm beer, listening to the conversations swirling around him, picking up snippets of local gossip and maritime lore. He casually brought up the albatross, feigning idle curiosity. The reactions were uniform: a sudden hush, averted gazes, a nervous shuffling of feet. No one claimed to know anything about the fire, the ship, or its captain. The wall of silence was impenetrable. He spent the next 2 days navigating the labyrinthine alleys and weathered wharves, seeking out anyone who might have had contact with the albatross or its crew. He spoke to chandlers, ship repairmen, and cargo handlers, offering cigarettes and buying rounds of drinks, hoping to loosen tongues. He encountered a mixture of genuine ignorance and carefully crafted evasiveness. Some claimed to have never heard of the albatross, others remembered it vaguely as just another freighter passing through. No one offered any substantial information. No one dared to speak ill of Samuel Wallace. The deeper he delved, the stronger the sense of unease became. He felt eyes on him, unseen observers tracking his every move. Twice he caught glimpses of shadowy figures lurking in doorways, disappearing quickly as he approached. The air of intimidation was palpable, a silent warning to back off. Finally, after 2 fruitless days, he found a lead. An old fisherman, his face etched with the hardships of a life at sea, sat alone at the end of a deserted pier, mending a tattered net. Jack offered him a cigarette, and the old man accepted with a grunt. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the mournful cry of gulls overhead. Jack cautiously broached the subject of the albatross. The old man's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "That ship," he muttered. Bad luck followed her like a shadow. He paused, taking a long drag on his cigarette. "And Wallace, he's a man who attracts trouble." Jack pressed him for more details. The old fisherman hesitated, glancing nervously around before continuing in a hushed voice. "They say Wallace deals in things that shouldn't see the light of day. Things that bring a lot of money and a lot of risk." He spoke of whispered rumors of smuggling operations, of illicit cargo moving through the port under the cover of darkness. He hinted at connections to powerful figures, men who operated outside the law and wielded considerable influence. "Wallace knows how to keep his mouth shut," the old man said, "and he knows how to make others do the same." He warned Jack to be careful, to tread lightly. "This town has a long memory," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "and some secrets are best left undisturbed." Jack left the pier with a mixture of hope and trepidation. He had finally found a crack in the wall of silence, a glimpse into the shadowy world surrounding Samuel Wallace. But he also knew that he was treading on dangerous ground, a place where curiosity could have deadly consequences. As he walked back towards the bus station, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that unseen eyes followed his every move. The whispers on the docks had given him the lead he needed, but they had also painted a target on his back. The bus ride back to the coastal town where he'd rented a room was a blur of anxieties. The old fisherman's cryptic warnings echoed in his mind, fueling the unease that had become a constant companion. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but he was too deep to back down now. He needed proof, hard evidence to link Wallace to the burning of the albatross. As the bus pulled into the small town, the setting sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the streets. He checked into his small hotel, the same one he'd been staying at since the start of the investigation. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, handed him his key with a perfunctory smile. He climbed the stairs to his room, a sense of foreboding settling over him. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and mildew. He flicked on the light switch. The room was a mess. Drawers were pulled open, their contents strewn across the floor. His suitcase lay open on the bed, clothes and toiletries scattered around it. Files he'd brought with him from his office were ripped open, their contents spilled across the table. Nothing seemed to be missing, but the message was clear: stay away from Samuel Wallace. He stood there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a surge of anger, followed by a cold wave of fear. He knew he was treading on dangerous ground. He called the local police, reporting the break-in. 2 officers arrived, their faces etched with the weary boredom of small-town law enforcement. They took a cursory look around, asked a few perfunctory questions, and filed a report. They offered little reassurance, suggesting that it was probably just kids messing around. Jack didn't believe them. This wasn't the work of mischievous teenagers. This was a deliberate act of intimidation, a warning to stay away from the albatross investigation. He spent the rest of the evening trying to piece together the scattered fragments of his files, a sense of unease gnawing at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that unseen eyes followed his every move. He decided to leave the next morning to return to his office and regroup. He needed to reassess his strategy, to find a way to expose Wallace without putting himself in further danger. He packed his belongings, carefully gathering the scattered documents and placing them in his briefcase. He checked the lock on the door twice before turning off the light and heading downstairs. As he stepped out of the hotel, he noticed a dark sedan parked across the street. Two men sat inside, their faces obscured by the shadows. He couldn't be sure, but he felt a prickle of recognition. He thought he'd seen them before, lurking in the doorways of the waterfront taverns. He quickened his pace, heading towards the bus station. He could feel their eyes on him, a palpable sense of being followed. He glanced over his shoulder, and the sedan pulled away from the curb, slowly following him down the street. He reached the bus station, his heart pounding in his chest. He bought a ticket to the nearest city, eager to put some distance between himself and the oppressive atmosphere of the small coastal town. As he waited for the bus, he noticed the sedan parked across the street, the two men still inside, watching him. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and anger. He knew he couldn't stay in this town any longer. It had become a cage, and he was the trapped animal. The bus arrived, and he climbed aboard, relieved to escape the suffocating tension of the town. He found a seat near the back, his briefcase clutched tightly in his lap. As the bus pulled away from the station, he glanced back through the window. The sedan was gone. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He spent the bus ride trying to make sense of the events of the past few days. The ransacked room, the shadowy figures, the menacing phone calls. It was clear that someone wanted him to stop investigating the albatross, and all signs pointed to Samuel Wallace. But why? What was Wallace trying to hide? He arrived in the city late that night, exhausted and on edge. He checked into a hotel near the train station, eager for a hot shower and a decent night's sleep. But as he lay in bed, his mind racing with unanswered questions, he knew he couldn't rest until he had uncovered the truth about the albatross and the secrets it held. He decided to confront Wallace directly. He knew it was a risky move, but he couldn't think of any other way to break through the wall of silence and intimidation that surrounded the case. He booked a train ticket back to the coastal town, determined to have a final showdown with the enigmatic captain. The next morning he arrived back in the town, the familiar scent of salt and fish hanging heavy in the air. He walked directly to the docks, his briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. He found Wallace on his boat, the seafarer, preparing for his next fishing trip. He approached him, his voice calm but firm. "Captain Wallace," he said, "we need to talk." Wallace turned, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "I think we've said all there is to say, Mr. Reed." "I don't think so," Jack replied. "I know you're involved in something illegal, something that led to the burning of the albatross. And I'm not leaving until I get to the bottom of it." Wallace's face hardened. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Reed." "Maybe," Jack said, "but I'm not afraid of you." Two men emerged from the shadows of the nearby warehouse, the same men Jack had seen in the sedan. They flanked Wallace, their faces grim and menacing. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He was outnumbered, outmatched. He knew he was in trouble. He stood his ground, his gaze fixed on Wallace. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear rising within him. "Kill me?" Wallace shook his head slowly. "No, Mr. Reed. But I suggest you leave this town and never come back. For your own good." The two men stepped closer, their hands reaching inside their jackets. Jack knew he had to get out of there. He turned and walked away, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back, but he could feel their eyes on him, a silent warning that he was treading on dangerous ground. He had confronted Wallace, and now he knew the true extent of the danger he was in. He had poked the hornet's nest, and they were coming for him. He booked the first train back to the coastal town. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks, the monotonous passing landscape, did little to soothe the turmoil in his mind. He replayed the confrontation with Wallace, the barely veiled threats, the menacing presence of his two companions. He knew he was walking into a lion's den, but the burning need to know, to understand the truth behind the albatross's demise, propelled him forward. He arrived back in the familiar salt-tinged air of the coastal town and went straight to the hospital. He needed to speak to Clara again, to revisit her fragmented memories, hoping that a fresh perspective might unearth something he'd missed. He found her sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at the restless ocean. She seemed more composed than during their first meeting, the initial shock giving way to a quiet sadness. He sat down beside her, choosing his words carefully. He apologized for the intrusion, explaining that he needed to clarify a few details about the night of the fire. He revisited her initial account, gently probing for more information about the explosions, the sequence of events, the behavior of the crew. At first, her responses were much the same as before, hesitant and vague. She spoke of the sudden blast, the confusion, the frantic scramble for safety. But as he gently persisted, asking specific questions about the location of the explosion, the type of cargo stored in the vicinity, a subtle shift occurred in her demeanor. Her eyes, previously clouded with trauma, flickered with a new emotion, fear. There was something, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, then trailed off, biting her lip. He encouraged her to continue, assuring her that anything she could remember, no matter how insignificant it might seem, could be crucial to the investigation. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. There was something they were carrying, she said, her voice strained, something they didn't want anyone to know about. Jack leaned closer, his attention riveted. "What was it, Clara?" he asked gently. "What were they carrying?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "It was a life raft," she whispered, "a special one, custom-built, hidden below deck." Jack frowned. A life raft? That didn't make sense. What could be so important about a life raft that it needed to be hidden? He pressed her for more details. "It wasn't just any life raft," she continued, her voice barely audible. "It contained medicine, experimental medicine, for Wallace's daughter." The revelation hit Jack like a rogue wave, knocking him off balance. Wallace's daughter? What did that have to do with the fire? He struggled to process the information, the pieces of the puzzle shifting and rearranging themselves in his mind. His daughter. "She's sick," Clara explained, her voice trembling with emotion. "Terminally ill. The medicine, it was her only hope. They were transporting it illegally, bypassing the regulations, to get it to her before it was too late." The pieces finally clicked into place. The heavier than expected weight of the ship, the secrecy surrounding the cargo, Wallace's evasiveness, the cryptic warnings from the old fisherman. It all pointed to a desperate act, a father's desperate attempt to save his dying child. The fire, Jack now realized, was most likely an accident, a tragic consequence of the clandestine operation. He asked Clara about the men who had threatened him, the men he'd seen with Wallace. She hesitated, her fear palpable. They weren't her crew," she finally said, her voice choked with emotion. They're others. Other parents. Their children. They're sick too." Jack's mind reeled. The men weren't Wallace's accomplices in some smuggling operation. They were other desperate parents, families who had pooled their resources, their hopes, to obtain the experimental medication for their dying children. They weren't trying to intimidate him to protect a criminal enterprise. They were trying to protect their last chance to save their loved ones. He had been so focused on uncovering a criminal conspiracy, so blinded by his own suspicions, that he had completely missed the truth. He had been chasing the wrong lead, pursuing a phantom while the real story, a story of desperation and heartbreak, unfolded right before his eyes. He looked at Clara, her face etched with grief and fear. He realized that he hadn't been investigating a case of arson and insurance fraud. He had been caught in the crosscurrents of a human tragedy, a desperate struggle against the relentless tide of fate. The weight of his misjudgment settled heavily upon him, a crushing burden of guilt and regret. He had been so wrong. The silence in the hospital room was thick with unspoken emotions. Clara's revelation had shattered Jack's carefully constructed narrative, leaving him adrift in a sea of uncertainty. He had been so certain of Wallace's guilt, so convinced of a criminal conspiracy, that he'd completely overlooked the human element, the desperate plea hidden beneath the surface of the official reports. He felt a profound sense of shame, a chilling realization of his own fallibility. "The medicine," he began, his voice hoarse. "What kind of medicine was it?" Clara hesitated, her gaze fixed on the floor. "It was an experimental treatment," she whispered, "for a rare form of childhood leukemia. Wallace's daughter, she's only 7 years old." The image of a young child, her life hanging precariously in the balance, pierced through Jack's professional detachment. He thought of his own nieces and nephews, their vibrant energy, their infectious laughter. The thought of their innocence being extinguished by a cruel twist of fate sent a shiver down his spine. "The albatross," Clara continued, her voice choked with emotion. "It was the only way to get the medicine into the country. The official channels, the bureaucracy, it would have taken too long. She didn't have that much time." Jack closed his eyes, trying to absorb the enormity of the situation. He had been so focused on the legalities, the regulations, the insurance protocols, that he'd lost sight of the human cost, the desperate measures taken by parents clinging to the last vestiges of hope. He opened his eyes and looked at Clara. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked, his voice gentle. She shrugged, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "I was scared," she whispered. "Wallace, he asked me not to say anything. He said it would jeopardize everything. He said it was their only chance." Jack understood. He understood the fear, the desperation, the lengths a parent would go to for their child. He had been blinded by his own prejudices, his own preconceived notions. He had judged Wallace based on circumstantial evidence, on whispers and rumors, without considering the possibility of a deeper, more human motivation. He stood up, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. He needed to speak to Wallace, to understand the full story, to offer whatever help he could. He thanked Clara, promising to do everything in his power to rectify his mistakes. He left the hospital and walked towards the docks, the salty air a stark reminder of the vast, unforgiving ocean that held the key to the real cargo of the Albatross. He found Wallace on his boat, the seafarer, staring out at the turbulent waters. He approached him, his voice heavy with remorse. "Captain Wallace," he said, "I owe you an apology." Wallace turned, his eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and suspicion. He didn't speak. Jack explained what Clara had told him about his daughter, about the experimental medicine, about the desperate measures taken to get it into the country. He confessed his own misguided suspicions, his erroneous assumptions, his blind pursuit of a phantom conspiracy. Wallace listened in silence, his face impassive. When Jack finished, he let out a long, weary sigh. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice quiet, "I understand you were just doing your job, but you almost cost us everything." Jack nodded, shame burning in his chest. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong. I'm sorry." Wallace looked out at the ocean, the waves crashing against the pier. "The medicine," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "it was in a custom-built life raft, designed to withstand extreme conditions. It had a GPS tracker, a satellite phone, emergency supplies. It was her last hope." He turned back to Jack, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. "The Albatross sank quickly," he said. "The fire, it spread faster than we could contain it. We didn't have time to retrieve the life raft. It went down with the ship." He paused, his voice choked with emotion. "I need to find it, Mr. Reed. I need to find that medicine. It's all I have left." Jack looked at the anguish etched on Wallace's face, the raw, primal grief of a father facing the imminent loss of his child. He felt a surge of empathy, a powerful urge to help, to atone for his own misguided actions. "I'll help you," he said, his voice firm. "I'll do everything I can to find that life raft." Wallace looked at him, a flicker of hope in his weary eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. Jack knew the task ahead wouldn't be easy. The ocean was vast, unforgiving. The Albatross lay on the seabed, a mangled wreck consumed by the depths. But he was determined to find the life raft, to recover the lost medicine, to offer a glimmer of hope in the face of overwhelming despair. He owed it to Wallace, to his daughter, and to himself. He had been wrong, and now he had a chance to make it right. He spent the next few hours with Wallace, poring over the ship's manifests, the cargo plans, the engineering schematics. They identified the precise location where the life raft had been stored, a secure compartment below deck near the stern of the ship. They reviewed the Coast Guard's sonar scans of the wreck, trying to pinpoint the likely resting place of the life raft amidst the debris field. He contacted his office, requesting access to satellite imagery, oceanographic data, and any other information that might aid in the search. He reached out to a network of salvage experts, divers, and marine engineers, assembling a team to assist in the recovery operation. As he worked, he learned more about the other families involved, the network of desperate parents who had pooled their resources, their hopes, in a last-ditch effort to save their children. He spoke to some of them, their voices filled with a mixture of hope and fear, their stories echoing Wallace's own desperate plea. He understood their desperation, their willingness to break the law, to risk everything for the chance to prolong the lives of their loved ones. He realized that the real cargo of the Albatross wasn't just the experimental medicine. It was hope. It was the unwavering belief in the possibility of a miracle. And he, in his misguided pursuit of a phantom conspiracy, had almost extinguished that hope. Now he had a chance to rekindle it, to help these families reclaim their last chance at a miracle. The search for the life raft began at dawn. The seafarer, Wallace's sturdy fishing vessel, cut through the choppy waters, leaving a frothy white trail in its wake. Jack stood on the deck, the salt spray stinging his face, the vast expanse of the Atlantic stretching out before him like a watery battlefield. He felt a heavy sense of responsibility, the weight of a dozen families' hopes resting on his shoulders. He worked alongside Wallace, coordinating the search efforts. They had a rough estimate of the Albatross's final resting place, a patch of ocean marked by a cluster of buoys deployed by the Coast Guard. But the ocean currents were strong, the seabed treacherous, the wreckage scattered across a wide area. Finding a single custom-built life raft amidst the debris field would be like searching for a needle in a haystack submerged beneath hundreds of feet of cold, dark water. They deployed a remotely operated vehicle, ROV, equipped with sonar and high-definition cameras to scan the seabed. The images flickered on a monitor in the seafarer's small cabin, a ghostly landscape of twisted metal, shattered wood, and scattered cargo. Hours passed, the tension in the cabin thickening with each passing minute. The initial optimism began to fade, replaced by a gnawing sense of despair. Jack maintained a constant communication with the salvage team on shore, relaying the ROV's findings, requesting additional equipment, coordinating the deployment of divers. He pushed himself relentlessly, driven by a mixture of guilt and determination. He had been wrong about Wallace, about the true nature of the Albatross's cargo, and he was determined to make amends. The weather began to deteriorate, the wind picking up, the waves growing larger. The seafarer pitched and rolled, making the search even more challenging. Jack struggled to maintain his focus, battling nausea and exhaustion. But he refused to give up. He knew that time was of the essence, that every minute lost diminished the chances of finding the life raft, of recovering the precious medicine it held. As dusk settled, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the ROV detected a large metallic object partially buried in the seabed. The image on the monitor was grainy, obscured by sediment and marine growth, but the shape was unmistakable. It was a life raft. A surge of adrenaline coursed through Jack's veins. He immediately directed the ROV to investigate further, to confirm the identification. The camera zoomed in, revealing the custom-built features Clara had described. The reinforced hull, the emergency beacon, the satellite phone antenna. It was the life raft. He relayed the news to Wallace, who stood beside him, his face etched with a mixture of hope and anxiety. "We found it," Jack said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "We found the life raft." Wallace's eyes filled with tears. He reached out and gripped Jack's hand, his grip strong and steady. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. The recovery operation began immediately. Divers were deployed, their descent into the dark, cold depths a perilous undertaking. The currents were strong, the visibility limited, the wreckage a treacherous obstacle course. Jack watched the monitors anxiously, his heart pounding in his chest with each passing minute. After what seemed like an eternity, the divers located the life raft, secured it with cables, and began the slow, arduous process of bringing it to the surface. The tension on the seafarer was palpable. The crew gathered around the monitors, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of the screens. Finally, after hours of painstaking work, the life raft broke the surface, its hull battered and scarred, its emergency beacon flashing weakly. The crew erupted in cheers, a wave of relief washing over the deck. Wallace rushed towards the life raft, his eyes fixed on the sealed compartment that held the precious medicine. He worked frantically to open the compartment, his hands trembling with anticipation. The seal broke with a hiss and he reached inside, pulling out a small, insulated container. He held it up, his face illuminated by the deck lights. The container was intact, undamaged. The medicine was safe. A collective sigh of relief swept through the seafarer. Jack watched Wallace, his face etched with a mixture of joy and relief, and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. He had been wrong, but he had been given a chance to redeem himself, to help a father save his daughter's life. He had been searching for a needle in a haystack, and against all odds he had found it. But the search hadn't just been for a life raft, or even for a cure. It had been a search for redemption, for the reaffirmation of hope in the face of despair. And in the depths of the ocean, amidst the wreckage of a burning ship, he had found it. The first sliver of dawn painted the eastern sky a pale lavender as the seafarer, battered but triumphant, limped back towards the harbor. The precious cargo, the insulated container holding the experimental medicine, rested securely in Wallace's cabin. He hadn't let it out of his sight since its retrieval from the depths. Exhaustion etched deep lines on his face, but his eyes shone with a fierce, unwavering hope. Jack stood on deck, the chill morning air a welcome contrast to the stifling tension of the previous night. He watched the coastline slowly emerge from the pre-dawn gloom, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. He had played his part, a small but crucial role, in a drama of human desperation and resilience. As they approached the harbor, a cluster of boats converged on the seafarer. Small fishing vessels, their lights still burning in the fading darkness, surrounded them, closing in like a pack of wolves. Jack felt a flicker of unease, a momentary resurgence of the suspicion that had haunted him throughout the investigation. Were these Wallace's accomplices, arriving to claim their share of the recovered cargo? Were they here to silence him, to erase any trace of their illicit activities? He glanced at Wallace, who stood beside him, his gaze fixed on the approaching boats. His face was impassive, but Jack sensed a subtle shift in his demeanor, a tightening of his jaw, a flicker of apprehension in his eyes. The boats drew closer, and Jack could see the faces of the people on board. They weren't hardened criminals, their expressions weren't menacing or threatening. They were ordinary people, their faces etched with worry, their eyes filled with a desperate hope. Men and women, some holding young children wrapped in blankets, their faces pale and drawn. These weren't Wallace's accomplices. They were the other families, the ones Clara had spoken of, the ones who had pooled their resources, their hopes, to obtain the experimental medicine for their dying children. They had come, not to claim their share of the spoils, but to witness the arrival of their last hope. The realization hit Jack with the force of a physical blow, a wave of empathy washing over him. He understood their desperation, their unwavering belief in the possibility of a miracle. He had almost robbed them of that hope, blinded by his own misguided suspicions. As the boats surrounded the seafarer, a woman's voice called out, her tone strained with emotion. "Samuel, did you find it?" Wallace stepped forward, holding up the insulated container. "We found it," he said, his voice echoing across the water. "The medicine is safe." A collective gasp rose from the surrounding boats, followed by a chorus of sobs, a mixture of relief and disbelief. Some cheered, others wept openly, their faces a mixture of joy and exhaustion. Children's voices, weak but hopeful, called out their fathers' names. Jack watched the scene unfold, his heart swelling with a mixture of sadness and hope. He had been so wrong about Wallace, about the other families, about the true nature of the cargo that had been lost and found. He had been so focused on uncovering a criminal conspiracy that he had failed to see the human tragedy unfolding before him. The boats escorted the seafarer back to the harbor, a flotilla of hope sailing towards the dawn. As they reached the dock, the families gathered around Wallace, their faces alight with gratitude and relief. They embraced him, thanking him profusely, their words a testament to the unwavering bond of shared hope and desperation. Jack stood back, watching the emotional reunion, a silent observer of a drama he had almost inadvertently sabotaged. He knew he had played a part in the recovery of the medicine, but he also knew that his role had been tainted by his initial suspicions, his misguided pursuit of a phantom conspiracy. He had been given a second chance, an opportunity to redeem himself, and he had taken it. But the experience had left an indelible mark, a humbling reminder of the complexities of human nature, the blurred lines between right and wrong, the lengths people will go to for the ones they love. The consequence of the brave sailor's rescue wasn't a vengeful act, as the initial reports had suggested. It was a testament to the power of hope, the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. It was a story of ordinary people, driven by extraordinary love, willing to risk everything for the slimmest chance of a miracle. And Jack, the insurance investigator who had arrived seeking answers, had found something far more profound. A glimpse into the depths of human compassion, the unwavering strength of the human heart. He knew he would never forget the burning ship, the desperate search, the dawn arrival of the other families. He would carry their stories with him, a constant reminder that sometimes, the greatest treasures are found not in the depths of the ocean, but in the depths of the human soul. He knew he would never look at an insurance claim the same way again. The numbers on a page would forever be imbued with the human stories they represented, the hopes and fears, the triumphs and tragedies, of the lives intertwined with the unpredictable currents of fate. And he, the man who dealt in facts and figures, had finally learned the true value of compassion, the immeasurable worth of a single human life. The sea, he realized, held more than just sunken ships and lost cargo. It held the reflections of our own humanity, the echoes of our shared hopes and fears, the timeless struggle for survival against the relentless tide of fate. And sometimes, in the darkest depths, it offered the glimmer of a miracle.